So welcome back. We are moving on to the next presentation for this morning, Rethinking the Conceptual Dichotomy in Early Money by Elon Heymans.
This works great. Good morning, first of all. I want to thank the organizers very much for their invitation. I'm happy to be here. I've learned a huge deal in the past a day and a half. In what is to come, I will try my hand at a theoretical paper, but I must admit that in the past day and a half, and this is more meant than as a compliment than anything, I've my faith in anthropological theory helping us out has not really been bolstered that much. So I feel I'm coming up with a slight bit of buyer's regret that I'm not presenting a paper on data, empirical data, but I will give it a try anyway. In 1986, in his 1986 article "Gifts and Commodity in Archaic Greece," Ian Morris wrote that since historians and archaeologists had benefited so much from ethnographically based models, that he wanted to repay some of the gifts received from anthropologists by providing evidence from case studies which might lead to a modification of these widely used models. Like him, I am convinced that the archaeological and historical record we study can be elucidated by anthropological theory. A little bit less so than when I wrote this, obviously. While we can pay back in coin the insights we gain from our perspective. So what I have for you today is a theoretical paper aimed at sharing some of my ongoing thoughts on how we can or should conceptualize money, especially from my perspective on the changing socio-economic landscape of the early first millennium BCE Mediterranean. As far as I'm concerned, the conference organizers have put the finger on the right spot in the introduction text, where they observe that one of the paradoxes of proto-historic archaeology lies in the antagonisms of the economic interpretations it gives rise to. While some models favor imperatives linked to social organization, systems of gifts and counter-gifts and redistribution, others are based on institutionalist interpretation that relies on markets, standards, or monetary tools. These dichotomous visions, sometimes based on the same archaeological data, tend to confront each other with no real agreements or compromises. This dichotomy pervades our thinking on the economy and applies in particular to the topic of currencies or money. As embodiments of the economic discourse, currencies have been regarded as key characteristics of economic life, supposedly reflecting in themselves the full genome of economic life. And as such, the dichotomy that the organizers observe regarding the economy have also shaped theories on money in the ethnographic and proto-historical record. These forms of money were referred to as primitive currencies, special purpose money, or social currencies, characteristic of socially embedded or human economies, and were placed in opposition to modern, commercial or general purpose money used in commercial or market economies by rational economic actors. In his best-selling Debt from 2011, the late David Graeber has sought to integrate theory on money into a historical model of economic development. According to his grand theory, credit, or virtual money, and cash or bullion, physical money, dominate in alternating cycles in the developed state economies of Eurasian history. I will come back to his work in a little bit, but what suffices for now is that Graeber argues at length that in the actual age, the period between 800 BCE and 600 CE, modern, meaning coinage specifically, was dominant, and debt was not social but impersonal and quantifiable, and subject to the market. Of course, it seems attractive to see state-issued coinage, a seemingly modern form of money, as indicative of market logic and opposed to human economies. But is this binary thinking helpful in understanding how historical change affects the role of money? Now, as a disclaimer, I have recently worked on a review essay on debt and this application of its ideas, edited by John Weisweiler, together with my friend and colleague Marleen Termeer from Nijmegen. It is therefore inevitable that some of my thoughts presented here today overlap with or have grown out of our discussions. It feels only right to mention her here at the onset. So in the following paper, I want to explore where this binary conceptualization of money comes from and whether we can see things differently. This I will try to illustrate using two cases from the Mediterranean. So, theory. Objects of value circulate in nearly every society of some level of complexity, and the conceptual dichotomy that has dominated ethnographic and anthropological theory on money since the mid-20th century aims to make sense of that by distinguishing between forms of money that we associate with modern economic behavior and forms of money that are different and that circulate in non-commercial societies. The big question of money in proto-historic economies is, where do we place the money we study within this distinction? Are the valuables we see money, or are these proto-monetary currencies? When does one turn into the other? And what happens to them when the socio-economic settings change? It seems to me that we're too often avoiding having to say anything in particular about the use and significance of these objects. At the same time, studying pre- and proto-historic economies, we are exceptionally well positioned to reflect on this. So I think we should take on the challenge and try to contribute more to this question. In order to understand what this distinction means, we need to go back. The original distinction, so to say, and I think Thibaut has said a little bit about that yesterday in the short presentations as well. The original distinction that between primitive and modern money dates back in international scholarship at least to the early days of ethnographic fieldwork, with Malinowski's insistence that the kula valuables could not be considered money, and Moses' rejection or retortion that in this view there is money only when tokens of wealth are made into money, when they are named, impersonalized, detached from any relationship with moral, collective, or individual persons other than the authority of the state which mints them. The above definition can only cover a secondary type of money, our own. And I think with this remark, basically, sort of the distinction between two types of money was born in anthropological scholarship. The concept of primitive money became established in scholarship in 1949, following the surveys of Paul Einzig and Quiggin, both of which presented a range of examples of primitive monies from the ethnographic and historical record. Oh, yes, this. I think you can tell the odd one out. Already in the 50s, Polanyi and other substantivist anthropologists, notably Paul Bohannon and George Dalton, sought to explain why primitive money was different. They came up with the idea that primitive money is limited in use. Either it does not perform all functions, or its use is restricted to specific spheres. This gave rise to the functionalist distinction between special purpose Oh, yes. So this slide was supposed to show 3 articles. The articles have disappeared magically, but the references are here, found at the bottom of the. I thought I'd lost a slide. Already in the 50s, Polanyi and other substantivist anthropologists, notably Bohannon and Dalton, sought to explain why primitive money was different. They came up with the idea that primitive money is limited in use. Either it does not perform all functions, or its use is restricted to specific spheres. This gave rise to the functionalist distinction between special purpose and general purpose money, the latter being our own money. Bohannon argued in his ethnographic studies of the Tiv in Nigeria that when Western general purpose money was introduced to Tivland, where only special purpose money had been known, this dissolved the traditional multicentric economy by creating links between the separate spheres in the economy. David Graeber has attempted to rephrase the distinction between special purpose and general purpose money, preferring the term social currencies and commercial money instead. These social currencies are characteristic of human economies, which, in the words of Graeber, are concerned not with the accumulation of wealth, but with the creation, destruction, and rearranging of human beings. This is rooted, ultimately, in the Marxist idea that communal rights to property would have prevented people from alienating their goods in exchange. Social currencies in these economies function within social interactions and enable the transfer of political or social capital, and were thus not economic in nature. And this is actually also what has been argued by Philip Grierson, an eminent numismatist in influential work. So back to this distinction, I think in the best case, this distinction is not suitable to distinguishing actually between different types of money, because we can't tell when one turns into the other. And perhaps in the worst case, the primitive or special purpose monies that anthropologists have described are reification of what they've came across in the colonial in their colonial perspectives. This dichotomy between social and economic is also reflected in the suggestion that modern money subverts traditional economies and depersonalizes social debt obligations, thus dissolving social structures. In Money and the Morality of Exchange, Maurice Bloch and Jonathan Perry, writing specifically about state-issued monies, sought to unseat the idea that money in itself has a set effect on the economy. Rather than focusing on the meaning of money, they argued to shift the attention to the broader range of transactions and the idea of two related but separate transactional orders. The short-term order is concerned with individual interest and competition. The long-term order is concerned with reproducing the long-term social and cosmic order, whereby the short-term should always be subordinate to the long-term transactional order. Money is most commonly, but not exclusively, and I think the example that Eneko showed yesterday of the gold coins might be an example of that. Money is most commonly associated with the short-term order, but the idea that money poses an intrinsic threat to the social order is rejected by Bloch and Perry. They claim, those that claim otherwise, they write, propagate a false history in which what is actually an extremely general contrast within cultures between the domains of the long and the short-term orders becomes a contrast between cultures. And it is on this basis that the notion of a great divide between monetary and pre-monetary worlds has rested. So an important advance is that Bloch and Perry developed a theoretical basis to see money not as necessarily indicative of a pervasive market logic, but that transactions within a society conform to different orders of socio-economic logic, one more concerned with individual benefit, the other more concerned with the social order. Money is neither inherently connected to one or the other, and we need to study society and its cultural logic to understand money's place in this. And I think this also goes back to what the keynote speaker said on Wednesday night, that we need to study society, we need to understand society in order to understand the economy. This has offered an interesting and non-deterministic way to look at exchange. At the same time, I wonder whether this opposition between the individual and the social order can and should always be maintained. The question I want to ask, and this is I think the core, is one of perspective. What social order is maintained on the long term, and in whose interest is that? In many instances, individuals or groups are compelled to develop new exchange strategies that reflect a break from the long-term transactional order, or might even be perceived as a threat. But how do we judge this? But how we judge this might really be dependent on our point of view. What can sound as a neutral, scholarly description of transactions carried out because of short-term gain and self-interest might, from a different perspective, using perhaps different informants or sources, be understood as an attempt to contest conservative elements in society. These supposed subversive actors could simply aspire to social or political change, something that need not reflect individual self-interest at all. At the same time, elites aiming to reproduce the social order by monopolizing certain objects of value could equally act out of self-interest under the banner of maintaining the social order. Yet there are also instances in which the short term offers a pathway into the long term order without apparent social conflict, and Bloch and Perry themselves emphasize the dependency between both these orders. Or instances where apparent transactions on the short term order and individual interest can foster new social orders and be considered long term as well. So short term develops into long term, so to say. Rather than seeing these differences as absolute, they are dependent on what perspective, social, political, or economic, one adopts. Now, as to my cases, I would like to further explore this using two cases, one on the late Bronze to Iron Age Levant and one on classical Greece. At the end of the late Bronze Age, in the 12th century BCE, Egyptian imperial rule in the Levant collapses. With it, harbors and trade routes are left insecure, long-distance trade networks suffer or disintegrate, and as a result, the social-political order in the region is placed under pressure. Luxury goods are no longer distributed by the Egyptians among the local elites, who are now forced to develop new strategies to supply their households and dependents of goods and maintain their social position. It is in this context that people resort to the use of hakzilber as an exchange strategy with both social and economic significance. And so, to be absolutely sure, I did not cut up the vessels in the upper picture to make this picture. So the upper picture is vessels from Taubasta, most of which are in the Cairo Museum somewhere in the Met. This is already cut up material from Taubasta with cartouches that enable us to date it specifically to the 12th century. And this is a hoard from the early 10th century BCE in Tel Megiddo in Israel. But you can see the practices of cutting up vessels or using elite prestige goods for this type of assemblage. So it is in this context that people resort to the use of hakzilber as an exchange strategy with both social and economic significance. This hakzilber consisted in large part of whole or fragmented jewelry or vessels, and is specifically known from urban centers with continuity from the late Bronze Age. This suggests that this type of cash-based exchange was adopted, at least initially, exclusively among a specific social group, urban elites with access to precious metal prestige goods that tried to maintain their social position in the new social political order. By appropriating such goods for exchange, they were acting for their own good, but at the same time actively engaging in group behavior as well. What we see here is that local elites from within the decapitated political structures adopted new forms of exchange, seemingly for short-term interest, that served to create new social frameworks that reproduce the social order under the changing and the challenging circumstances. The second case concerns the emergence of money in the Greek world. By the 8th century BCE, precious metals start to play an important role in the Aegean as well. I will now focus not on its initial spread, but rather on its significance in the polis, the Greek city-state. Coinage is, of course, the form of money that is so clearly and explicitly associated with the polis, or the community. It is issued by the polis, it bears the symbols of the community. The innate connection between money and the community, but the innate connection between money and the community predates the earliest coins. I will show you one piece of evidence to illustrate this point. This inscription contains the so-called retra, or law of Chios. And actually, the reference here is Lillian Jeffrey in 1956 in the annual of the British School of Athens. It dates to the early 6th century and contains one of the earliest epigraphic appearances of the word stater in Greece, probably its earliest public use. The lead tablet from the Artemisium that Alain just showed is probably a little bit earlier, but it's not a public document. This is significant because of the context in which the term is used. The law is mostly procedural. It means it deals with how to organize the framework of law, and states that if he has been wronged in the Demarcos court, let him deposit a stater, implying that in order to appeal to the courts, one needed to pay a stater. Since the inscription predates the first Chian coins, this presumably refers to a stater in bullion, in uncoined silver. Another possibility is that the Chians would have used coins that were minted in Ephesus or Miletus or wherever. This new form of money, while no doubt being used for short-term transactions, also provided access to the court, an important new institution of the community and focus of its social order. And I just said that it's presumably used for short-term transactions, but at the same time, apparently they were using this money to enable themselves access to the court in a time before people used to do their groceries in the market in kiosks. No doubt that took a long while before monetization had set into a level that they could. So it's very interesting to see that actually the initial use of these types of legal tender are not at all in a marketplace necessarily, at least not for citizens. Certainly for traders it would have been, but for citizens this would have been the initial, or at least one of the initial uses. Let us now turn to classical Athens. We consider Athens to be a developed market economy, but also here we can see how money can serve short-term individual interests, while at the same time serving to reproduce the community. During the 5th century, huge quantities of Athenian coins were produced. Importantly, these coins, the famous tetradrachmas, were produced for international trade. But from the mid-5th century, Athens established jury duty by lot with financial compensation. For this purpose, a large volume of small denomination coinage was produced, which fostered an historically unprecedented form of monetization. And Alain has discussed the concept of deep monetization a little bit already, so I need not address that any further. This reform no doubt extended coin use to all citizens. And by the end of the 5th century, participation in the ecclesia, the assembly, is also remunerated. It is easy to see, as the comedy writer Aristophanes ridicules, how this attracted participants motivated by self-interest. But at the same time, they were doing something that was profoundly cultural, using experimental but uniquely local expressions of value that were explicitly linked to their membership of society, the polis. Now that community extended beyond the formal rules of citizenship, and by the early 4th century there is clear evidence of social mobility, exemplified by freedmen acquiring great wealth. And the orators of the 4th century describe these. The examples are Basion and Formion, freedmen who were very successful businessmen apparently. The old oligarch laments this when he notes that one can no longer tell a citizen from a slave, saying, "For the people are no better dressed than the slaves and metics." But obviously wealth takes different forms, and intellectuals and elites were rather annoyed by the role of wealth as a source of economic inequality in their community. It is at this point that thinkers start to frame coinage as a specific and sanctioned form of money in the community. In his final work, The Laws, Plato proposes a law which forbids any private person to possess any gold or silver, only coin for the purposes of such daily exchange as is almost necessary for craftsmen to make use of, and all who need such things in paying wages to hirelings, whether slaves or immigrants. For these reasons, we say that our people should possess coined money, which is legal tender among themselves, but valueless elsewhere. So he abolishes other forms of money or capital, but emphasizes that a successful society would have coinage, but only for internal use. In his criticism on classical Athens, and obviously as a simple historian I'm not a specialist in political philosophy, but Plato has quite some criticism on Athens. It appears that Plato thought that coinage would, ideally function as a nomisma symbolon, a frame he uses in his earlier work, The Republic, a token money, and that it would tie the community together. So what we see, So what we see is that Athens of the classical period underwent pervasive monetization, and quantifiable monetary debts were a great concern of society and its institutions. Evidently, for many, money characterized, even epitomized, the individual's self-interest in society. At the same time, adopting these new and experimental forms of money, Greeks aligned themselves with and created new social frameworks. The polis was obviously one of these frameworks. These frameworks were not exclusively economic in nature, but were closely related to the new institutions of the community. For these members, monetary exchanges, and in the classical period coinage, clearly belonged to the long-term transactional order as well. Now, to sum up, we took off from the opposition observed by the organizers, that between social models of interpretation and the economic models of interpretation. This dichotomy, I've argued, has long pervaded anthropological theories about money in one way or the other. Moreover, it has implicitly stimulated historical thinking, whereby money inevitably leads to expansion of the market and its logic and a series of associated elements. The truth is that anthropology and ethnography has given us a lot to think about. But these models have provided challenges in themselves as well. Challenges that we might not be able to fully disentangle. Perhaps this is most evident in the fact that we continue to use our own economic behavior as a point of reference. For example, when we use phrases such as money like our own or money similar to our own. In discussing Bloch and Perry's two transactional orders, I have tried to suggest that our interpretations can easily depend on the point of view we adopt. By being aware of that point of view, we can perhaps better see how the economy of early societies, not unlike our own, can have different stories to tell. In that regard, money should not be seen as either social or economic, but as something that can be both. Thank you.